The Bigfoot tracks I found led to a grave, and I have never told anyone why. The tracks began at the creek crossing and ran northeast into the old timber for about 300 yards before I found what they led to, and I want to be precise about the sequence of discovery because the sequence is the thing that has stayed with me for 12 years. I found the tracks first. I found the grave second. I did not know, when I was following the tracks, that I was following them toward a grave, and I did not know when I found the grave what the connection between the two things was. I still do not know what the connection is. What I know is that the connection is there. The tracks ended where the grave began, or close enough to where it began that the distance between them was too small to be coincidental. And I have been sitting with the question of what that connection means for 12 years, and I am no closer to an answer than I was the morning I walked out of the timber and drove home without telling anyone what I had found. Let me tell you about the country first because it matters to what happened, and because it is the container for everything. The Flathead Valley in northwestern Montana runs west from the Continental Divide through a landscape that changes character every few miles. The high alpine giving way to the timber belt dropping to the valley floor spreading out toward Flathead Lake and the Salish Range to the west. The specific piece of ground I was working that November was in the timber belt east of the valley, in a section of mixed western larch and ponderosa pine and Douglas fir that had been partially logged in the early 90s and had been recovering since in the way second-growth mixed conifer recovers. Unevenly with dense brush in the cut areas and residual old growth in the sections the loggers had left. The patchwork that creates is good elk habitat, which is why my brother and I found it in the first place, and why I have been coming back to it for 23 years. The larch in November in the Flathead is at its most striking. The needles have turned and fallen, which means the larch stands are bare while the ponderosa and Douglas fir around them are still green. And the result is a specific light quality in the timber that is unlike any other time of year. The bare larch lets the low November sun through in a way the summer canopy does not. And the forest floor is covered in gold needles and the light is warm even when the air is cold. And the whole thing has a quality of openness and visibility that makes it the best time of year to be in this country, if what you are doing is looking at things carefully. I have been looking at things carefully in this country for 23 years. That is the foundation on which everything I am about to tell you rests. My name is Fletcher Odom. I am 54 years old and I have been hunting elk in the Flathead Valley and the surrounding timber since I was 31. Always the same general drainage, always the same November timing, and always, for the first 20 of those years, with my brother Curtis. Curtis died 3 years before the November I'm going to describe. That is background information you need before the rest of this account, because the grave is connected to Curtis in a way that makes no sense without the context of who he was and what he was to me in this country. Curtis was my younger brother by 4 years. He was the better hunter of the two of us. Better eyes, better patience, better instinct for where the elk would be on any given morning in any given weather condition. He had a way of reading the timber that I have not found in any other person I have hunted with. A quality of attention that was native to him rather than learned. He was 44 years old when a stroke took him in his shop in Kalispell alone in the afternoon. And the country has not been the same country without him in it. I do not mean that sentimentally. I mean it as a literal description. The Flathead timber is a different place when you are in it alone than it was when you were in it with a person who knew it the way Curtis knew it. And the difference is not something you can compensate for by bringing someone else. I went back 3 years after he died because not going was beginning to feel like abandonment of something that belonged to both of us, and I did not want to abandon it. I set up at the camp we had always used alone, and I sat in the dark on the first morning and I listened to the November timber and I thought about Curtis for a long time before I thought about anything else. Curtis was 44 when he died. A stroke, sudden, the kind that comes without warning and without the decency of a gradual approach that allows the people around you to prepare. He was in his shop when it happened, alone, and he was not found until my mother called in the afternoon and did not get an answer. I was in the Flathead that week, hunting, and I drove back to Kalispell when I got the call, and I arrived at the hospital in time to say what you say in those circumstances to someone who may or may not be able to hear you. He died that night. We had been hunting the same timber together since we were teenagers. Curtis knew the ground as well as I did, which is to say, well, not like a biologist or a researcher, but like a hunter, which means he knew where the elk moved in the early season and where they moved in the late season, and which draws held water in dry years, and which ridgelines funneled the morning thermals in a way that put the wind in your favor on the approach to the upper meadows. He had a specific relationship with the Flathead timber that was his own, different from mine in its emphasis and its attachments, and losing him meant losing a companion in the country and losing access to his version of the country, which is a specific and irreplaceable thing. I went back 3 years after his death. I almost did not go. 3 years without Curtis in the Flathead had produced a specific gravity around the decision to return that I had to move against deliberately. I went because not going was beginning to feel like ceding the ground, which Curtis would not have wanted and which I did not want either. I drove up in early November alone, and I set up at the camp we had always used together, and I sat in the dark on the first morning listening to the timber and thinking about Curtis. I was on the creek crossing on the second day when I found the tracks. The creek in November runs low before the serious cold sets in, and the banks on the far side of the crossing have a section of soft mud that holds impressions cleanly. I have found elk and deer and bear tracks in that mud every season for 23 years, and I check it as a matter of habit when I cross. It is the kind of automatic check that hunters develop. You cross the water and you look at the far bank. Usually you see nothing, or you see deer, or you see the broad oval pad and claw marks of a black bear. That morning I saw neither of those things. 2 prints in the mud. Left and right foot of the same stride, bipedal. The left print showing all 5 toes clearly and the heel in the mid-arch in the specific flat-footed plantigrade impression of an upright biped carrying weight through the ball of the foot. The print was not a bear print. A bear's plantigrade impression has the toes set in a specific arc with the claw marks above them, and the heel narrower in proportion to the toe spread than what I was looking at. This had a heel that was wide and round and set deep, and the toe impressions were arranged in the flat spread of a foot designed for upright locomotion rather than occasional upright posturing. The length was 18 inches. I measured it with the ruler on my boot knife, which I carry because 8 years before this trip I found a single track in the Flathead that I could not account for and had nothing to measure with and have regretted it since. 18 inches. The stride between the 2 complete prints was 63 inches measured heel to heel. I want to rule out the bear question properly because anyone who has hunted the Flathead Valley will ask it, and it deserves a complete answer. Black bear track morphology in soft mud is specific, and I know it well from 23 years of finding bear tracks in this drainage. A large black bear boar has a front print running approximately 5 inches in length and a rear print running approximately 7 inches with claw marks registering clearly above the toe pads. The largest black bear track I have found in 23 years of hunting this drainage measured 9 inches on the rear foot. What I was looking at was 18 inches. It was not a bear. It was not a person. I have my own tracks in that mud from previous crossings, and I know what my size 11 boots produce, and this was not that. It was not anything in the catalog of animals that I have been reading tracks for in this drainage across 2 decades. I photographed both prints from multiple angles with my phone, and I noted all the details in the notebook I carry in my vest, and then I looked northeast along the bank in the direction the tracks had been heading, and I made a decision I have examined many times since. I followed them. I followed them because I am a hunter, and a hunter follows tracks. And because the 8 years since the single unidentified track had given me a specific orientation toward evidence of this kind. Note it, document it, and then see where it goes, because where it goes is data. And because, if I am being fully honest, Curtis had been in this section of timber in his last hunting season, and I had been in it 3 years since and had not found anything of note, and the tracks were a thing of note, and it was the second morning and I was still alone in the country without him, and following the tracks was the most alive I had felt since arriving. The tracks ran northeast for about 300 yards before the mud gave way to duff and the impressions became too faint for reliable tracking. But the direction was consistent enough that I had a line to follow, and I followed it into the timber, and about 320 yards from the creek bank I found the grave. I need to be precise about what I mean when I say grave, because the word carries implications that I want to be careful about. What I found was not a human grave, no marker, no mounded earth, no evidence of human activity in the conventional sense. What I found was a depression in the forest floor, roughly oval, approximately 6 feet by 3 feet, with a quality of deliberate excavation that was different from the random depressions that wind-thrown roots leave when they pull free from the soil. The depression was maybe 8 inches deep at its center. The edges were compressed in a way that suggested the soil had been packed rather than merely displaced, and the surface of the depression was covered with a layer of fresh cedar boughs. Not fallen boughs, cut boughs, each one snapped cleanly at the stem in the way a branch is broken by deliberate bending rather than wind stress. The boughs were fresh enough to still be green inside the breaks. They had been placed within the previous 48 hours. On top of the cedar boughs were objects. I am going to list them as I found them because the list is what I have and the list is precise. 3 pine cones from the larch above set in a row along the western edge of the depression. A piece of what appeared to be elk hide, roughly hand-sized, the fur still on it, the edge torn rather than cut. A flat river stone, pale gray, placed in the center. 2 sections of stripped alder bark, each about 8 inches long, laid parallel to each other near the eastern edge. I stood at the edge of the depression and I looked at what was in it for a long time without touching anything. I am a hunter. I know what the timber does to itself and what the timber does not do to itself. I know what wind damage looks like and what root throw looks like and what the freeze-thaw cycle does to soil over winter and what the result of that is in spring. I know what the ground looks like where a bull elk has been wallowing, and I know what it looks like where a bear has been digging for grubs. I know what people do in the timber. I have found campfire rings and gut piles and discarded gear and the occasional deliberately buried cache in 23 years of hunting this drainage. And I know what people do not do. What I was looking at had not been done by any of those agents. The depression itself, that deliberate oval excavation with the compressed edges, was not wind throw, not root disturbance, not frost heave. The compression pattern at the edges was the pattern of soil packed by something pressing down and outward from the interior. The same compression pattern you see at the edge of a post hole or a fire pit. Something had prepared the surface. The cedar boughs had been broken deliberately. I checked 3 of them by pulling the break apart and looking at the fiber pattern, and each one showed the compression and tearing of a branch bent and snapped in a single motion, not the irregular fracture of wind failure. And the nearest cedar of the right size for these boughs was on the slope above, at least 150 yards from the depression. The boughs had been carried, the river stone in the center. The nearest running water was the creek at the crossing, approximately 300 yards to the southwest. The stone had been carried from the creek or from somewhere along it. The arrangement of the objects, the pine cones in a row along the western edge, the elk hide near the center, the stone, the alder bark parallel to each other at the eastern edge, was not random. I am not going to claim I can read it the way you would read a message because I cannot. What I can tell you is that I have been looking at timber for 23 years, and I know the difference between a random distribution of materials and a placed distribution, and what was in the depression had been placed. I thought about the tracks at the creek. The line from the crossing to the depression was consistent enough that the connection required no inference beyond the basic one. Something large and bipedal had been at the creek and had moved northeast into the timber and had come to this place. Something with the track size and morphology of what I have spent 12 years calling, in my own head, a Bigfoot, because that is what the morphology is consistent with, and because 12 years of refusing to use the word has not produced a better one. I took photographs of everything before I touched anything. Many photographs from multiple angles with and without my hand in the frame for scale. Then I documented the positions of every object in my notebook with measurements, the way I would document a significant piece of elk sign that I intended to return to. Then I sat down on a root buttress at the edge of the depression in the November larch light, and I thought about Curtis. I am going to tell you why, and the why is the part that has kept this account private for 12 years. I am going to tell you why, and the why is the part that has kept this account private for 12 years. Curtis died 3 years before this November. In the year before his stroke, the last season we hunted together, we had spent 2 mornings in this specific section of timber. Not at this depression, which I had not found before and which I do not believe existed before, but in this general section, east of the creek and north of the upper meadow. On the second of those mornings, Curtis had come back to camp at midday looking the way he looked when something had given him pause. Not frightened, not excited, but the specific, thoughtful quality he had when something had entered his experience that he was still processing. I asked him what he had seen, and he said, "I don't know." I said, "Elk sign?" He said, "Not elk." I said, "What then?" He said, "I'm not sure." And then he made coffee and we moved on. That was the whole of that conversation, and I did not think about it again until I was sitting at the edge of the depression 12 years later with my notebook open and the cedar boughs and the river stone and the elk hide in front of me, and I thought, Curtis was in this section of timber a year before he died, and he saw something he did not know how to name. And now there is a depression in the forest floor covered in carefully arranged objects in the section of timber where he saw it. I do not know what that means. I want to be clear and explicit about not knowing, because the not knowing is not modesty or evasion. It is the accurate description of my epistemic state. I do not know if what Curtis saw in his last hunting season was the same animal that made the tracks at the creek. I do not know if the depression in the forest floor is related to Curtis's presence in the timber or if it was there for reasons entirely unconnected to him. I do not know if the arrangement of objects in a prepared depression has any relationship to mourning or commemoration, as those practices are understood by whatever made the arrangement. What I know is this: Curtis saw something in this section of timber that he could not name. Curtis died. 3 years later, I followed tracks made by something I cannot name to a prepared depression covered in arranged objects in the same section of timber. The tracks ended at the depression. The depression was fresh. And I sat at its edge and I thought about my brother with a completeness and a presence that I had not been able to access in 3 years of trying. Whether those facts are connected is a question I cannot answer. Whether the connection I felt sitting at that depression was a thing in the world or a thing in my grief is a question I cannot answer either. Both of those questions are genuinely open, and I hold them open. What I can tell you is that I sat at the edge of the depression for most of the morning. and that when I left I did not disturb anything in it, and that I walked back to camp and made food and sat in the camp chair in the November cold, and I did not call anyone. Not my mother, not my friends, not the hunting partner I had been bringing up since Curtis died. Nobody. I sat with it alone the way Curtis and I had sat with things alone together, which is the way two people who have spent 20 years in a piece of country together eventually sit with things. Not always talking, just being present to what is. I went back to the depression the following morning. I had thought about it for most of the previous afternoon and evening. I sat at the camp with the November cold coming down, and I thought about the depression and the tracks and Curtis and the conversation he and I had not had in his last hunting season about what he had seen in this section of timber. I thought about the paracord in my vest pocket, which had been there for 3 seasons. It was a piece of orange and black paracord, maybe 18 inches, that I had used the last season Curtis and I hunted together to rig the tarp corner over the shelter when the camp pole we always used had split. Not significant, just a piece of cord that had stayed in my vest after that trip without my having any clear reason to keep it there and without my having any clear reason to remove it. I went back in the morning and the depression was unchanged. Cedar boughs in place, objects undisturbed, the compression at the edges exactly as I had found it the previous morning. I stood at the edge and I thought about what I was about to do and whether I should do it, and then I took the paracord out of my vest pocket and I set it on the flat river stone in the center of the depression. I do not fully know why I chose the paracord specifically. I had other objects available, my notebook, my measuring tool, objects from the camp. I chose the paracord because it was the thing in my pocket that had been from that last season with Curtis, and that had no other purpose for being there. And because placing it felt like the right gesture for a reason I could not have articulated clearly at the time and can articulate only a little more clearly now. It was from the last season with him. The section of timber east of the creek was where he had seen something he could not name. And I had followed tracks to a prepared depression in that section, and the paracord was the thing I had that connected to him. I stood at the edge of the depression for a while. Then I walked back to camp and packed out the following morning. I have been back twice since. The 2nd November after the original finding, the depression was still there, but the objects had been removed. The cedar boughs gone, the pine cones gone, the elk hide gone, the river stone in a slightly different position from where I had placed my paracord, which was no longer there. Whether the objects were removed by the animal that placed them, by weather, by other animals, or by something else entirely, I cannot tell you. The depression itself remained, the soil still compressed at the edges in the deliberate way I had noted. The 3rd November after the original finding, the depression had a new layer of cedar boughs in it. Fresh ones, the breaks still showing green inside, no objects on top of the boughs. Just the boughs, arranged with the same care as the first time. My paracord was not in the depression. I do not know where it went. I have been back to the depression 3 times in the 12 years since the original finding. The 2nd November, the year after I first found it, I returned with the same equipment, the same notebook, the same intention to document whatever I found. The depression was present, unchanged in its dimensions and the compression of its edges. The cedar boughs were gone, the objects were gone. The river stone had been moved approximately 2 feet to the north of where I had found it originally, which may have been weather or wildlife and may not have been. There was nothing new in the depression. I noted all of that and I photographed it and I walked back to camp. The 3rd November, 2 years after the original, the depression had fresh cedar boughs in it. Not the same boughs, fresh ones, the breaks showing green inside when I pulled a stem apart, placed in the same layer formation as the first time. No objects on top of the boughs, just the boughs, arranged with the same deliberate coverage of the depression floor. I added nothing of my own that year. Of my own, that I photographed it and I sat at the edge for a while and I walked back. It was the 4th November, 3 years after the original, the November, I contacted Simon. That I brought someone else. Simon Whitfield works the Northern Rockies documented record out of Missoula and has been doing so for 17 years. And he came up the day after I called and walked the section of timber with me. He stood at the edge of the depression for a long time before he said anything. He photographed it with better equipment than I had, and he examined the cedar boughs and he walked the perimeter twice. Then he said, "The preparation of a depression site and its periodic maintenance with fresh organic materials is documented in the Northern Rockies and Pacific Northwest reported record, but a confirmed multi-year return to the same site is rare in the documentation." He said, "The fact that you have 3 separate November observations of maintenance activity at a single site is significant." He said the return and the replacement of the bough layer suggests the site is actively maintained, not abandoned. I asked him what the site was for. He said, "I have several hypotheses and none of them are satisfying." He said that with the specific honesty of someone who has been in this work long enough to distrust satisfying hypotheses. I respected that. I said, "What does the reported record say about sites like this?" He said, "The accounts are not consistent with each other in their interpretations. Some describe them as territorial markers. Some describe them as what the accounts call commemorative sites, places marked in connection with some event or entity. Some describe them as rest sites or shelter preparation that was abandoned before completion." He said, "The arrangement of specific objects on top of the prepared surface does not fit the rest site hypothesis well." He said, "The specificity of the object selection and placement is more consistent with what I would call intentional marking." I said, "Intentional marking of what?" He said, "That is the question I cannot answer from the evidence available." He did not ask me about Curtis. I did not tell him about Curtis. That connection, my brother in this section of timber in his last season seeing something he could not name, and 3 years later the tracks in the depression, is not something I have been able to give to another person in a way that does not reduce it to either grief or wishful thinking. And I do not believe it is either of those things. I believe it is an observation that sits at the edge of what evidence can support, and I hold it there. And I am giving it to you in the same form I have been holding it, as something that may be connected, that I cannot prove is connected, that I cannot make myself believe is not connected. The Albert Ostman account from 1924 described beings with social practices and domestic arrangements, and the character of a community that had been in a specific piece of Pacific coastal country for a long time. He held that account for 33 years before telling it. The Stazales First Nation has been documenting Saskats in old-growth continuous habitat since centuries before any European arrived on the coast. Simon Whitfield's 17 years of Northern Rockies documentation shows a pattern of long-term site use. Specific drainages, specific trees, specific locations returned to across seasons and years. That is consistent with a population that knows its range intimately and has been in it for a very long time. The Flathead Valley timber has been here for a long time. Whatever uses it has been using it for a long time. My brother spent 20 years in it, and I have spent 23. And the section of timber east of the creek and north of the upper meadow was ground that 2 men from Kalispell walked every November for 2 decades with their elk tags and their thermoses and their notebooks. And we were in that country the way people who love a piece of ground are in it, attentively, repetitively, with the specific quality of care that amounts to a relationship. Whether we were observed across those 20 years, I cannot tell you. Whether what my brother saw in his last hunting season was the same animal that made the tracks I followed 3 years after his death, I cannot tell you. Whether the depression in the forest floor is connected to any awareness of him or of his absence, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that the depression exists and has been maintained for 12 years. that the cedar boughs are replaced on a schedule I cannot predict but can observe, that the tracks at the creek and the heading to the depression are connected by morphology and direction and distance in a way that is not consistent with coincidence, and that my brother was in that section of timber in his last hunting season and said he had seen something he could not name. Those are the facts. The connection between them is something I hold without forcing it into a shape it has not offered me. And I am giving you those facts and that connection in the same form I have been holding them, carefully, without more certainty than the evidence supports, and without less significance than 12 years of sitting with them has produced. I leave something at the depression now when I visit. Not food. I know enough to know that food changes the dynamic in ways that are difficult to manage. Objects. The same principle I read about in habituation accounts from the Pacific Northwest, adapted to my own situation and my own understanding of this site. I leave objects that have been in my hands, that have my smell on them, that are specific rather than generic. Last November, I left a piece of larch bark I had split from a log at the camp. Old-growth larch, very old, the bark running to 2 inches thick at the split. I set it at the western edge of the depression where the pine cones had been in the original arrangement. In the morning it was gone. I sat at the edge of the depression for a while, and then I walked back to camp and packed out the following morning and drove back to Kalispell. I went past the house my brother died in, which belongs to someone else now, and I drove to my own house and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about the 12 years of returning to that section of timber and what they had produced. They have produced more questions than answers, which is the consistent result of careful observation of things that do not fit the available categories. They have also produced something I did not expect when I started going back, which is a specific quality of company in the timber. Not the company of Curtis, who is gone and whose absence remains structural. A different kind of company, the awareness of something present in the country that I am in, that knows I am in it, and that has its own relationship to the section of timber east of the creek and north of the upper meadow that predates and will outlast my own. That is not comfort exactly. I am not offering it as comfort. It is just what the 12 years have produced, observed as carefully as I can observe it, held as honestly as I can hold it. The paracord is gone. I do not know where. The cedar boughs come back. I go back every November. I check the depression. I sit at its edge for a while in the November larch light, and I think about Curtis. And I think about what the timber holds, and I add something of my own to what is there. Then I walk back to camp. That is the whole of what I have. That is what the Flathead timber has given me in 12 years of returning to a place I found by following tracks that I could not account for to a site that I could not explain. In the 2nd November, after I went back to the country without my brother for the first time, the timber holds what it holds. I am grateful it has let me see some of it.